Welcome, everyone. I'm Ted Ruger. I'm the Dean of the Law School at Penn, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here to the Center for Ethics of Rule of Law Conference, as well as our annual Haaga lecture. We say at Penn Law that we pride ourselves at not being in an ivory tower of obscure theoretical and legal issues, although we do study those quite well. We also try to connect with some of the most pressing issues of the day, and indeed today's topic is quite literally ripped from the headlines, kind of law and order style about foreign interference in elections. We couldn't be happier with the topic and couldn't be happy with our distinguished speaker, General Michael Hayden, who will be more properly introduced by a colleague of mine in a moment. So my job is really just to welcome all of you who've come both locally and from far and wide, and from students, faculty, staff, alumni, and others new to Penn Law and across the university. It's good to see you in this room. We celebrate and we'll dive into the topic, this crucial topic that has been, you've already been discussing this afternoon, and to which we have the keynote speaker in a moment. We also celebrate this annual turn in one of our flagship annual lecture series, the Haaga Lecture in Government. And I first want to start out by thanking Paul and Heather Haaga for your support of the Haaga Lecture in Law, Government, and Public Policy. Paul's wife, Heather Haaga, established this lecture series in 2013 as a gift to the law school in honor of Paul, who has served the law school and continues to serve the law school in many capacities. He has chaired our Board of Overseers. He's been a stalwart advisor and supporter, currently chairing the board of the Center for Ethics and Rule of Law, and has been a mentor to me in my first 2 years as dean in many ways, including how to grow a beard. So Paul, under Paul's tutelage, that I appreciate that, Paul. So in all seriousness, thank you and Heather for your tremendous engagement and support of the law school, and you're the reason we're here for this lecture. The other visionary who helped bring this day together, who leads the flagship Center for Ethics and Rule of Law, who helped arrange the topic, and the speaker today is my colleague on the faculty, Professor Claire Finkelstein, the Algernon Biddle Professor of Law and Professor of Philosophy. For the past 5 years, she's directed and built this tremendous organization, CERL, or Center for Ethics and Rule of Law. I'm pleased to see so many board members and other people involved with CERL in the room today. It's a fabulous organization, and I credit Claire and the support of many of you in the room for building that. And also thank you, Claire, for bringing this event together. And with no further ado, I do want to turn it over to you to introduce our distinguished speaker, and thank you for your work on this.
Thank you, Ted, for those kind remarks about CERL. And the important announcement that I always forget, I'll make again. Kindly silence your cell phones, or we'll have to ask General Hayden to send a signal to the powers that be and have them silence for us. So welcome to the distinguished annual Haaga Lecture and the keynote address of CERL's Conference on Foreign Interference in Democratic Institutions. We are delighted to have General Michael Hayden with us today to deliver one of the University of Pennsylvania's most distinguished lecture series. Before I introduce General Hayden in detail, I'd like to issue some words of thanks to those who have made today's event possible. First and foremost, I'd like to add my thanks to Ted, to Heather and Paul Haaga for endowing this lecture series, in particular to Heather, who endowed it, as Ted said, as a gift to her husband, Paul. Heather, who is a visual artist and a member of numerous public sector boards, is a dear member of the Penn Law community, and unfortunately she was unable to join us today, but I hope she is watching on live stream at home. Paul has already been introduced by Ted, but I would just like to thank him in particular for his engagement as chair of CERL's executive board. It is really an honor and a privilege to work with Paul, so thank you, Paul. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors of this event, the American Enterprise Institute, as well as the Center for Advanced Research in Global Communications of the Annenberg School of Public Policy, and last but not least, the law school and my dean, Ted Ruger. So thank you so much to our co-sponsors. And finally, I would also like to thank our excellent Searle and Law School event teams. First, Carlton Halig and Nick Seidel, who are our two Searle Fellows, Josh Spector, who is a Penn Law student and a student in my seminar this term, and our amazing events team, Debbie Reck and Elizabeth Allup, as well as Jen Evans from the law school support staff. I'd also like to thank our new executive director, David Sadoff, who unfortunately could not be here because of a death in his family. It is truly because of the Searle and law school teams that such a small center as ours can, as Paul always likes to say, punch above our weight. So a round of applause, thank you for the great teams that we've assembled. I wish now to introduce General Hayden. Michael Hayden is a retired four-star general who served as the director of the National Security Agency from 1999 to 2005. Following that, from 2005 to 2006, he was the first principal deputy director of national intelligence and was then named the director of the CIA by President Bush from 2006, where he served from 2006 to 2009. General Hayden also served as commander of the Air Intelligence Agency and director of the Joint Command and Control Warfare Center, and served in senior staff positions at the Pentagon, at U.S. European Command, at the National Security Council, and the U.S. Embassy in Bulgaria. He was also the deputy chief of staff for the United Nations Command and U.S. forces in South Korea. Hayden has been a frequent expert and commentator on major news outlets and in top publications. He's valued for his expertise on intelligence matters such as cybersecurity, government surveillance, geopolitics, and more. He is also the author, as if this weren't enough, of a best-selling book called Playing to the Edge, American Intelligence in the Age of Terror, which was selected as one of the 100 most notable books of 2016. He is currently a principal at the Chertoff Group and a distinguished visiting professor at the George Mason University Schar School of Policy and Government. Please join me in welcoming Michael Hayden.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. And Claire, thank you for the overly generous introduction. Look, I got a challenge here, all right? I've got to say something new and interesting after listening to a full dozen really intelligent people comment on today's topic. And Claire has given me very specific instructions, 30 minutes, and you're out of here, all right? So buckle up. We're going to be racing through some commentary here. I'll just offer a few observations about the topic, and this is coming from a career American intelligence officer, all right? I'm not pretending to be anything else, so it's a perspective from that point of view, and then I think the order of march is Claire and I are going to have a conversation here, and then you all get to jump in with questions of your choosing and comments. So I look forward to that. So let me begin with the Russian thing, all right? Let me give you my appreciation for what happened, and very starkly and just to the point, all right? The Russians conducted espionage to break into the DNC, John Podesta, Colin Powell, and a host of other what you and I would call protected persons, U.S. citizens, and stole their emails. Now, let me be really honest. I'm coming at you as the American intel guy, right? That is honorable international espionage, all right? That is an accepted international practice, and if I, as the director of NSA, could break into the emails of United Russia, and if I thought it made a difference what those emails said, we'd have done it in a heartbeat. Okay? What makes this different is what happened to the material after the espionage, and that is weaponizing the data and shoving it back into the American information space through WikiLeaks, through DC leaks, through a host of other sources, and then having an army of trolls treat the data in a way that the Google algorithms pulled the data forward, made it trending, so that you and I would pay a great deal of attention to it. Right? That is classically called a covert influence campaign. Right? And the purposes of the covert influence campaign, according to your intelligence services, at a level of high confidence, it began with messing with our heads. They just wanted to sow the kinds of confusion that was already been alluded to. Right? There was also an element of punishing Hillary Clinton because he hates her. He blames her for those 2011 demonstrations that were referred to earlier in Moscow. And then the motivation seemed to slide as the overall influence campaign got traction to create serious injury to the legitimacy of the woman who was clearly going to be the 45th president of the United States, to make her a less effective president. And then September-ish, maybe, I think it began to dawn that maybe that wasn't a foregone conclusion. And again, high confidence judgment, the Russians put their thumb on the scale in an attempt to influence the election outcome. That's high confidence. Not quite court of law, but it's what your intelligence services say happened. All right? I think they did influence the election. How much they influenced the election is not just unknown, it is unknowable, and therefore we're done talking. There's nothing more to be said about the legitimacy of the current president, who is the legitimate president of the United States. Now, as probably the only speaker you're going to get here today who may have actually been involved in covert influence campaigns, okay? Covert influence campaigns do not create fractures in a society. Covert influence campaigns exploit fractures in a society, something that's already been suggested in our question and answer period. The Russians, give them credit, on a professional level, knew us at least as well as we knew ourselves, and went after the vulnerabilities in the American political dialogue. So I'm going to talk a little bit, this might be odd, but again, from an American intelligence officer's point of view, looking back into American society. We have a tendency, and believe me, as a former director of CIA and NSA, I've experienced the tendency, we have a tendency to make everything we argue about a struggle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. All right? We do it with healthcare. Who knew it was so complicated? All right? I mean, you know, those who know understand that cost, quality, and coverage are the variables, and if you affect one in a positive direction, the other two go south. All right? It's not because anyone's predecessors were weak, stupid, or corrupt. Okay? It's just because these are wicked problems. But we define our political dialogue, again, in the forces of light and the forces of darkness. And that's particularly troubling now, already alluded to by one of the questions earlier, about the source of news that we now get. Talk radio, Twitter, blogs, not the curated news that we have historically been exposed to. And so when leadership moves in the direction of the forces of light and the forces of darkness, it gets multiplied again and again by the way that news is distributed. And I think it was perhaps Luke or someone else who said, your Twitter account is comprised of people who think like you, and you get reinforced those hardened attitudes. I've seen that drama, and I'm going to spend a minute talking about it. I've seen that drama in the endless debate we have about security and privacy, about liberty and safety. All right? We again turn it into the forces of light and to the forces of darkness, when frankly, it's the kind of questions that mature societies have to address all the time as to where they want to put the fulcrum in that balance based upon the totality of circumstances in which they currently exist. I can't believe I'm saying this in Philadelphia, but, you know, it was King George, too far over here. Articles of Confederation, whoa, too far over here. Let's come up here and write a constitution. I like that. Oh, I'm not accepting that unless you give me a Bill of Rights. I mean, it's the normal tacking that free people do, trying to balance things that are both virtues and which they want to have in full measure, but they can't. I actually did a foolish thing a couple of years ago. I decided to debate this question at CPAC. Okay. The Conservative Political Action Committee at National Harbor down in Washington. And my debate opponent, was Andrew Napolitano, the returning judge to Fox News. And by the way, is a good friend, and he goes out there and just kind of throws red meat out to 11,000 libertarians, saying that I am a full-throated libertarian. Huzzah, huzzah. Now he gets all done, and I go out there and I'm a libertarian too. No, you're not. Boo! But I'm a libertarian whose professional responsibility tends to another part of the document that refers to provide for the common defense. And so often we just get lost in the condemnation, demonization of one side or another. So now I know we've got multiple investigations. We pointed out, kind of film at 11, the Senate, Intel, Senate Judiciary, FBI, House not so much. And the issue there is collaboration. The issue there is, was what the Russians did aided and abetted by anyone in, around, affiliated with the Trump campaign? Let me offer you a thought. The only collaboration that the Russians needed to facilitate their covert influence campaign against the United States was an atmosphere in which we believed it was legitimate to chant "lock her up" at political rallies, and "I love WikiLeaks" was an acceptable form of political discourse. Marco Rubio, one of the candidates at the time, actually took, I think, a highly principled stand in which he said that is not something we should be saying with regard to WikiLeaks. I teach at George Mason, as Claire mentioned. I teach a class on intelligence and policy. And I begin each semester literally at the level of metaphysics. I begin with Plato's parable of the cave. All right, the fire, the shadows, the voices, the travelers. And I let the students kick that around for a little bit in terms of Plato's question, is the pursuit of truth a worthy endeavor? Of course, the answer is yes. And then I amp it up with, is the secret pursuit of secret truth a worthy endeavor? And obviously that has to do with espionage. And then I really torque up the conversation. Is the secret pursuit of secret truth compatible with a Western democracy? And I'm here to report, after about 15 semesters, so far 100% of the students, when asked that question by the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, who will give them their final grade, have said, yes, the secret pursuit of secret truth is indeed compatible. And then that's all wind up, and the pitch, the core message I give them is, it's just not compatible with. It's essential to. And I talk about, what I say is frightened people don't make good Democrats or Republicans, small d, small r. Frightened people gnaw, when they're a little scared, on their neighbors' rights and liberties and privacy. And when they get really good and scared, they start gnawing on their own. After 9/11, I talked to the NSA workforce. I was director of NSA at the time. It was a long speech. I actually found a copy of it in doing research for my book. But I ended the speech, what I thought was the most important message I gave, which was, look, free peoples have always had to decide where on that banner between liberty and security, that spectrum between liberty and security, privacy and safety, they put their banner. We Americans, already alluded to earlier today, two big oceans, neighbors who were weak and or friendly, always tuck the banner up next to liberty and to privacy. I said that's what's been put at risk by the attack on September 11th. And so here's the game plan. We at NSA are going to keep America free by making Americans feel safe again. Now, I understand, and you've had discussions here in your previous meetings about things that my agencies, plural, have done with regard to safety, liberty, privacy, and security. Understand the fairness of the debates. All right, and those are worthy things that a free people always have to have. I just want to point out, and it's important to my overall messaging here about they exploited fractures in our society, they didn't create them. I want to point out that my personal life experience is that American espionage is not a threat to American democracy, that American espionage is a bulwark in the defense of American democracy. But we have a hell of a time explaining that to the larger population for reasons of transparency and secrecy and sources and methods. So you made mention that a couple of years ago you had Chris Inglis up here, right? And Chris, I'm sure, was trying to explain to you the 215 program. That's the metadata thing, and all cards all face up. I started that October 2nd, 2001. Okay, I'm the guy. Leave the debate about good idea, bad idea, indifferent idea aside. NSA was horribly backfooted by the public outcry when the Snowden leaks came out and the first 215 revelations were in the press. Okay? There was a little political pressure not to take it on publicly, but the agency actually felt that they were going to be okay with this debate. And they felt they were going to be okay with this debate because the 215 program, the metadata program, the phone bills, phone records up at Fort Meade, and these are massive databases, had been approved by 2 presidents, had been legislated by Congress, had been overseen by the 2 intelligence committees, both House and Senate, who actually were pretty big fans of the program, and was overseen by the FISA court. So my old friends at NSA pretty much felt they had the Madisonian trifecta going in there. Okay? They had the executive, the legislative, and judicial approval, just the way the great compromises of the 1970s had said they should do this. As it turns out, that this uproar didn't die down after a couple of days. A lot of Americans, and I'm just not referring here to the wingnuts, I'm talking about the solid center, people without tinfoil on their heads, actually said, what you just said, Hayden, you know what? That no longer constitutes consent of the governor. That may be consent of the governors. In other words, you may have told them, but you didn't tell me. And that is a tectonic shift in the place of, again, remember where I began the discussion, essential to the survival of American democracy, not just compatible with. That is a serious threat to the longevity of what I think is an essential government function. So this discussion we had up here about transparency earlier on is really critical, and it's actually tied in its own way to the broader question we all began with, the departure point, the DNC hack, what the Russians did, and so on. My old community is going to have to be more open with you. Otherwise, they're not going to get your validation and legitimization. Now, I back away from the word transparency. Let me give you one you can use at a cocktail party. We need to be translucent, okay? And the literal meaning of the word translucent is you see the broad shapes. You get the general outline of what is happening, but you're denied the specific details, which of course has a tremendous operational cost. Now, to pull that forward into the current discussion, David Sanger brought this up, Carrie mentioned it as well. My old community is going to need to tell you not just more of what it is they do on your behalf, but what it is they discover on your behalf. To recall well, it was already mentioned, I think it was you, Carrie, October, December, and January, there were intelligence community judgments put out there with regard to the Russian hacking. Recall that? And the Trump campaign pushed back. It's a 400-pound guy on a bed in his basement. It could be the Chinese. It could be anybody. The intelligence guys stuck to their guns. All right? And again, I gave you the high confidence judgment to begin my commentary. But when they rolled the white paper out in January, all you got were the judgments I just gave you. You got none of the supporting data underneath it. Right? And frankly, in a political culture like our own, trust me, we're from the government is not the best selling point when it comes to putting out there something that has such great political import and impact. And so I do this at about the back 25% of my book. I talk about the need for my community, not just to be transparent about what it is they do, but again, more forward-leaning in terms of what it is they discover on your behalf. David Sanger mentioned this earlier. We are caught in an industrial age paradigm of how we protect sources and methods, which is still really important. But sources and methods in the post-industrial era are so rapidly changing that the context within which we make those decisions is changed. Let me go on and talk about some other things that I think are affecting the role of intelligence in American society as truth teller, all right, which is a theme I'm going to come back to for the remaining time I have up here. You all familiar with the tweet Saturday morning about 6 weeks ago? President Obama tapped my phones at Trump Tower, right? And you know all the evolution of the story that's come out after that, right? I was on a TV show of a famous Philadelphian, Michael Smerconish, 2 or 3 weeks ago, and in which I actually said, Michael, I think I know where this is going. Because the original tweet was so unfounded, but no one would be willing to tell the emperor about his clothing situation. And so they were trying to backfill a story that gave it some plausibility. And I said, Michael, I can see where this is going. This is going to incidental collection, where data to, from, or about an American is picked up. And then in the intelligence reporting, intelligence clients get to ask to unmask the American identity if it is essential to understanding the intelligence value of the original report, right? And if that interests you, ask some questions about it. This is something I actually know something about in great detail. Do you realize accusing Ambassador Rice of doing that for political purposes? Do you realize the blast area that accusation creates for the truth tellers in American intelligence? I've already suggested to you, what I used to say as director of NSA is, hey, look, we only need to be two things to be successful. We need to be secretive and we need to be powerful. And we exist inside a political culture that just trusts only two things: secrecy and power. The American espionage enterprise, as I've already suggested, rests uncomfortably within the broader American culture. I've already told you it's essential too, it's honorable, but the fit there is always a challenge. But we get a hall pass. We get, I'm not enthused, but I know why you got to go do it, because we have always been and have been seen as apolitical, that we have not been used for a political purpose. If you believe the current accusation that Ambassador Rice did this for political purposes, then you have to believe that my old community was willing to do things that were going to be used for political processes rather than the security of the nation. And I'm just trying to come back to the broader concept I'm trying to relate to you here, that this is about fractures in our own society that are being exploited. I mean, if I'm sitting back and I had this career choice in the Russian Federation, to have a running gun battle between the incoming administration and the intelligence community that exists only to serve the incoming administration has got to be the biggest W in the win column that anyone could ever put up. Let me develop a little bit more this truth teller aspect, and then I'll stop and be under the time limit, and we can get on with our conversation. I tell a story about the role of intelligence in its relationship to policymaking. All right. And by the way, this works whether it's a canvas-covered talk in a desert somewhere in the Middle East, all the way up to the White House. The intel person and the decision maker have to get into the same room and have to have a deeply meaningful conversation. But they come into the room through very different doors. The intel guy comes into the room, or gal, with the door marked facts. The decision maker, the policy maker, let's just cut to the chase, the president, comes into the room legitimately through a door marked vision. You know, the thing you voted for him or her for. Fact, vision. World as it is. World as we want it to be. Inherently inductive. Sea of data, generalized conclusions. Inherently deductive. First principles. How do I apply them to a specific circumstance? Fact, vision, as is, want to be, inductive, deductive. One more, inherently pessimistic. Okay, it comes with the job. Bob Gates has a wonderful line. When a CIA analyst stops to smell the flowers, she then looks around for the hearse. All right? Inherently pessimistic, inherently optimistic, otherwise they would not have interviewed with you for the job. All right? This is a permanent relationship managing challenge. We knew that if Mr. Trump was going to be elected president, this would be an above average challenge in getting to the merge. But no, my point is, we had to do this with President Bush. We had to do this with President Obama. We would have had to have done it with President Clinton, although we were almost there because of the Secretary of State time. She was probably in that space already. And we had to do it with President-elect Trump. And it was going to be a heavier than average lift because President-elect Trump had this stuff over here in double or triple dosage. All right? He has an intuitive way of thinking about the world. He has an a priori narrative about how things work. And before we get too quickly judgmental, those are the instincts in the a priori narrative that actually got him elected president of the United States when all the experts over here said that wasn't going to happen. So we've got to respect that. And so that was always going to be a heavier than average lift. It is a great American tragedy that the first time we had to get to that merge, the first time we had to get to that deeply intense dialogue, was over a question that was being used by other Americans to challenge his legitimacy as president of the United States. It was on the very issue around which today's discussions have been orbiting. There has been an overall attempt to delegitimize fact-based institutions like intelligence, or like science, or like the academy. Okay? Fake news, so-called judges, intelligence showing up in tweets, always between accusatory quotation marks. I'm gonna go out of my professional lane a little bit and just talk about more broadly what I think is happening here. Walter Russell Mead divides American presidents by archetypes. He has particular historical figures. He's pegged President Trump as down the center of the lane Jacksonian. All right? And by the way, President Trump self-identifies as a Jacksonian. He's gone to the Hermitage already. He's got the big picture of President Jackson in his office. And by the way, that should also tell you this is not a stray electron in the American political process. This comes from deep roots that go back deeply into American history. Jacksonians have a tendency to view America as a nation. If we were using different languages, I would have used folk or narod. Okay, it's soil and blood. Okay, which is a bit in juxtaposition to the Hamiltonian, Wilsonian view of self, which is we the people. Okay. In the Jacksonian view, it's the dedication to the nation, and again, a bit of ethnicity and race and blood. In the Hamiltonian, Wilsonian view, it's we the people and the process and the idea of America rather than the country of America. Hamiltonian and Wilsonian approaches reflect the values of the Enlightenment. And I guess the way I want to end, in just a few more minutes here, I want to suggest to you that the fracture that is going on in American society is a challenge to the values of the Enlightenment which are translated for us by fellows named Madison and Hamilton, and in the document written in this city and in the Federalist Papers that were designed to support that document. The values of the Enlightenment are fact-based, sound familiar? Respectful of investigation and observation, respectful of the value of experience, a recognition of the complexity of real problems, and a humility in the face of that complexity. And I see one of the trend lines that the Russians were able to so ably exploit, a challenge to that basic substructure of the American approach to living and deciding. And so I actually see, in a way it was actually quite striking, but I see it. I believe this really to be true. I actually see the American scholarship, the American legal profession, American journalism, and American intelligence in the bunker together, pushing back on a narrative that we've not faced, certainly in my lifetime, as to how we approach things. A remarkable moment took place, and I really must have, remember, I started with not a threat to, but a bulwark for American democracy. You probably didn't, you saw it, I know you did, I'm going to tell you the event in a minute, but you didn't see it the same way I did. And that was the testimony a couple of weeks back of Jim Comey and Mike Rogers in front of the House Intelligence Committee. All right? That is the head of the federal police force, Federal Bureau of Investigation. And Mike is the head of the largest intelligence organization in the United States. He's got 35,000 people working for him. In open session, the head of the federal police force, the FBI, and the head of the National Security Agency, in response to direct questions in open session, said that the chief executive they loyally serve was wrong with regard to the claim that he made with regard to wiretapping of Trump Tower. Only in America. Does that question get asked? And does that question get answered in open congressional session? And it is a reflection, already alluded to in the first panel, about how the structure of our government, the separation of powers, was designed to guard against not just tyranny, but foreign influence. To come full circle, I repeat, the Russians influenced the American electoral process. That they were able to do that is more shame on us than it is shame on them. I fear that they could only lead us astray because we had already lost our own way a bit. And with that, I'm happy to take your questions. Okay. I'm over there.
Thank you so much for those incredibly interesting remarks. And little did I know you were a philosopher and taught about Plato. That's great. I'm going to ask you about
I actually
Plato.
had a word in my notes that I didn't use. I was going to say Manichaean, which would be the first time you heard an American intelligence officer use that word. But it goes back to the starkly divided nature of our debates.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you about Plato a little bit later. But let's start with the characterization of the Russian campaign to influence the election as you've described it, the most successful covert influence campaign in the history of covert influence campaigns.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, to take a mature Western democracy and turn it on its head the way they did, God, that's awesome. I mean, just in terms of the tradecraft that is involved. Now, again, we gave great opportunities because of the nature of our dialogue and the internal fracturing of our society. And I guess some of this could be just dumb luck. You know, they're throwing things against the wall and some stuck. But I don't think so. I think they were quite knowledgeable.
So my question is, you've also said, however, that it's not an act of war, or that these are not acts of war.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, I can't think of an act of war in recent times that has had that kind of impact. So one question is, when we think so much about military threats, are we looking in the wrong
Sure.
place, right?
Yeah.
Are our greatest threats actually non-military?
So, I mean, as the intel guy, I mean, I could have followed up on some of the strands of conversation we had on the panels earlier, which was, how do we defend ourselves against this, right? So, I mean, there's a cybersecurity question. Really, cyber was just an enabler here. It wasn't the thing. It was the information space, the information dominance. A phrase used up here earlier, this was an information operation, which has great meaning for someone with my background, all right? Changing perceptions, okay? I could have talked about countermeasures. I could have talked about putting the Russians at risk. I could have talked about deterrence, all right? But I actually thought, and I actually thought it might have more impact coming from the guy you would have expected to talk about countermeasures and cybersecurity and so on, to actually say that the most efficacious thing we could do to prevent these kinds of effects, not the attempt, but these kinds of effects in the future, has to do with us as a people and what it is we believe and think and do for ourselves. By the way, if you want, it was mentioned in one of the earlier panels, so when the president-elect is finally briefed on this in January, and up until that point, it was no, not true. How do you know? You can't tell. They finally went up, Jim Comey, Jim Clapper, and Mike Rogers, and briefed them. The tenor of the pushback changed. And at that point, the incoming administration accepted the narrative that the Russians had done what I described. When they came out and did the press op, all right, it was really quite fascinating. They came out and said, you know what we got here? We got a cyber problem. I've been telling you we got a cyber problem. You got the Russians, you got the Chinese. No, that's not what they were briefed. They were briefed, we got a Russia problem. Okay? But they pivoted to a cyber problem because that's a more digestible political admission than saying we got a Russia problem. And so when people ask me what we should do, if I'd have done that presentation rather than this one, what should we have done? I'd have said, don't drop this in the cyber box. Drop this in the Russia box.
So now let's follow up on that. If you take the real challenge in thinking about what United States national security requires of the intel community and of the leadership that will act on that information, how should we think about the nature of warfare and the threats that we're confronting? One way to think about it, though this raises additional issues, is with regard to preemptive action, right? So we're used to thinking perhaps we can take preemptive action to forestall a military strike. Can we take preemptive action to forestall a cyber strike? Some cyber strikes will be acts of war, but this goes much beyond that because we're talking about a cyber covert influence campaign.
So there are lots of ways to deter enemy action. And the traditional way is retaliation. That's mutually assured destruction and so on. But there are other ways. Right? Number one, making the probability of success so low that it's not worth the candle in the first place, which is kind of what I was suggesting here. I was struck by the earlier panels. They were very cautious. You didn't hear any hawks up here in terms of preemption or massive retaliation, whatever that might mean.
So I had to ask those questions.
Yeah, and so people were very, very cautious. Look. Very quickly, I got dipped into this domain in the 1990s. I came out of Europe where I was the head of intelligence for U.S. forces in Europe. I mean, I had a war in the Balkans that was medieval in its causes and in its conduct. And I get dropped into San Antonio, Texas, you mentioned in the bio, head of the Air Intelligence Agency. And the Air Force is actually leaning pretty far forward in cyber. And at that point, my guys never quite said this, but the sum total of my first couple of days was, General, glad you're here. Sit down, take out a clean sheet of paper and a number 2 pencil, and write this down. Land, sea, air, space, cyber. It's a domain. It's a theater of operation. It's a place. That is now actually American military doctrine. Okay? We've got about a generation and change experience in this domain. Okay. We've got decades in this one. We've got more than a century here and eons down here. Okay. This is so new, we don't know what to call things up here. You had the Sony North America attack, you mentioned in the earlier panel. President Obama goes out. One of the few times we dimed out the attacker, President Obama goes out and says it was the North Koreans and it was a horrible act of cyber vandalism. And I'm watching him saying, good on you, Mr. President, dime out these guys. Cyber vandalism? Vandalism? Vandalism is what you do with a spray paint in a subway car, all right? Come on, Mr. President, say what it is. This was cyber. That was 3 years ago. I have not yet finished my own sentence. Okay? I don't know how to adequately, to my own satisfaction, categorize what the North Koreans did. And so I'm not embarrassed not having an answer. But and again, the panels you had here moved the ball forward in terms of the national discussion that we've got to have. But this is one final point. We can always use more technology. We can always use more trained people, all right? But the long pole in the tent in terms of mature American response to this kinds of things is law and policy, not capability.
Just a last question in this area. We often talk about comparing cyber to other areas, other types of harm by the level of destruction.
Right.
Can we really adopt that kind of definition of a cyber attack, given that we see that cyber attacks can be very weak in origin and very powerful in effect?
Yeah.
It's very hard to think about intervention then in terms of effects. How do we deal with that?
So American declaratory doctrine is that we will respond to a cyber attack based upon its effects, not upon its means. And so the earlier discussion here where you're not confined to responding in this domain, that you may actually use tools down here, is American declaratory doctrine, and frankly one with which I've got no problems. I think that's the right approach.
If you take that seriously, then, and I don't want to force you to pin down on something that you haven't made up your mind about, but if you do take that effects doctrine, it does suggest an approach to preemptive action that would allow for intervention on the basis of cyber effects.
But again, up here on my thumb, a lot of things down here on my fingers don't roll up here. All right, they just don't. So here's a domain. The greatest concentration of cyber power on this planet is about 3 stops on the Acela down there near BWI Airport. It's at the junction of Maryland Route 32 and the Baltimore-Washington Parkway. All right, no question. The greatest concentration of cyber power, U.S. Cyber Command and the National Security Agency. No one else is in the same league. This is a domain in which overwhelming offensive power does not translate into any level of defense. In all these other domains, in maritime domain, air domain, if you've got offensive power, it translates very quickly into the ability to defend yourself. It does not transfer up here, at least in the same way.
So let's talk about another area, which is the response of the intelligence community to the first suggestions of Russian interference with the U.S. election. You've also said elsewhere that the Russians were not particularly secretive about their actions, and that in some sense, one of the ways that they played with our minds was to let us know they were doing this, right?
Yeah, it wasn't all that covert.
Yeah.
Right.
So if they were so open about it, in effect, why were we so late to discover it?
Well, this is one of those times where I'm glad to say I am a retired former senior intelligence official and bear no responsibility for this. I don't know. And now I'm going to offer you some hypotheses, all right? This is so far off the map. This is so unusual that there may have been a lag, not in the discovery of the details, but in the appreciation of the broader impact. All right? Now that's happening inside the intelligence circle. Now remember this door, that door, got to get in the room, got to have a mind meld. All right? How thick a portfolio do you think you might want to have? How big an evidentiary stack do you think you need before you go into the President of the United States and say, we've got an unprecedented activity here that may actually challenge the foundations of American democracy? Do you want to hear more? Okay. Seriously, I mean, there is always that reality.
So in your view, were intelligence services too slow to call this out?
Again, I don't know the division of labor, the division of responsibility between the intel guys and the policy people, all right? But by the way, when you're going in there with incredibly unhappy news, it's not enough to throw it through the transom, all right? You got to go and grab them by the lapels and say, you got to listen to this. And so where in that division of labor this fell, the administration admits, all right, late to need, late to respond, some regret that they didn't amp this up earlier, make it more public, and frankly be a bit more threatening to the Russians with regard to the activity.
Yeah, there have been a lot of explanations about why President Obama was not more active in addressing this. One of the explanations is, of course, that he thought Hillary was going to win, so he didn't take the threat too seriously. But another explanation is that he was very afraid of being perceived as biased. Is that a danger also for the intel community, right?
That's a great question, and I'm going to turn it 15, 20 degrees right here, right? And not on that, but on the current investigation, all right? How do you go about investigating the possibility of collaboration between the campaign of the sitting president of the United States and a foreign actor? Now, and the answer is very carefully, all right? It's how you do it. But again, they're literally off the map here in terms of what intelligence is normally asked to do. I mean, look, one of the unusual aspects of what I chose to talk about here is I normally talk about red. Okay? I don't talk about blue. All right? And here's an intelligence challenge that's purple, that in which red and blue could very well be integrated. And so I do not envy them the task of remaining foreign intelligence services who have peculiar responsibility to protect the privacy of U.S. persons and still get to the bottom of this issue. Now, you've got a separate track over here, which is the FBI criminal investigation. That's a different dynamic.
So let's talk about the tools that are available to Intel. And you mentioned the 215 metadata program, which was so incredibly controversial. I was always puzzled that people were more focused on the metadata program than the 702 program, right? Because 702 is picking up actual substantive data. Now, of course, that program has come more into relief as President Trump has claimed that there was data collection on Trump Tower. Is it the case, as far as you understand it, that the only truth there might be to that is that there may have been some incidental data collection based on surveillance of a foreign entity? So
here's, boy, a lot of things come to mind. Number one, the 702 program has to do with email content. All right, and NSA must be targeted against a non-protected person, non-US, not inside the United States. Right, so it's legitimate foreign intelligence. Why it needs special legislation is where the information is collected. All right, so in essence, it's an appreciation of a new reality. Not everything in America is of America in terms of communication. And frankly, it's a legislation and an expansion of the authority that President Bush gave me a couple of weeks after 9/11. All right? So don't confuse the 702 program with the current Trump Tower debate. All right? Okay. Although there are many people who want to in order to fuel opposition to 702. And there are interesting things about 702, and I can come back to that in a second. The Trump Tower thing, and my thing with Michael Smerconish a couple of weeks ago, was, oh, man, I know what's happening. I parsed very, very carefully Chairman Nunes's press conferences, all right? Remember the dead of night, the documents, the White House, okay. He said this was not about Russia. It had nothing to do with an investigation. It was legal collection. It was authorized. It was warranted by a court. Had to do with foreign intelligence, and it occurred in November, December, and January. Duh, okay. That's every embassy in the United States going crazy because their national capitals are beating them up because they did not predict the outcome of the American election. And they're saying, what's going on? All right? And so, but by the way, I get to say this because I've got no briefings, all right? This is just me looking back on my life experience, giving you what I think is the logical explanation. So what you've got is American intelligence doing what it is you want American intelligence to do, gauging foreign nations' reactions to the peaceful change of power in the United States. Peaceful, controversial, not totally like any of the other transfers of power, and you've got foreign capitals and embassies in this rich dialogue. So NSA is picking it up. And when the information merits intelligence value, reports it. But NSA, in an effort to protect American, by the way, I mean, if you believe what I've said here, there's got to be a whole bunch of stuff about Americans in the intelligence product. But NSA tries to suppress American identities, right? Now, it's not an absolute rule. If the American identity is essential to understand the intelligence, NSA can put it in. But bureaucratically, they are notoriously cautious. Right. And so they lowball it with not this man, woman by name, but named U.S. person number one. And then they make someone ask, well, who's named U.S. person number one? I can't understand it unless all right? And so the reports go out. Now, sorry, it's a long answer, but it's an important one. Already, the report has been judged to have intelligence value by a career intelligence professional at NSA. Otherwise, it's never reported. So now it gets to an intelligence consumer, and he or she, in this case, says, you know, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me until you tell me who named U.S. person number one is. The request then goes back to NSA. NSA adjudicates it. They're the final arbiter. NSA, a request from a national security advisor would have a lot of throw weight, all right? NSA responds to the question, and the identity is then revealed to the requester, not to the original distribution of the intelligence report.
And this is, I take it, what happened with Secretary Rice.
I have no reason to believe that anything other than what it is I've just told you is what happened. Now look, all right, I cannot read Ambassador Rice's heart, and any legitimate government authority can be abused. But I just told you what I think was the arc of actually what happened here.
And you talked about the damage and effect that it does to have the president attacking the intelligence community, attacking this kind of program, and Secretary Rice's role in with engaging in what, in effect, you describe as standard intel procedures. What kind of damage do you think it has done to the ability of the intel community to function and to gain information that it needs on foreign threats?
So a couple of
domestic threats.
Right. So a couple of things. The relationship between the president and the intelligence community is absolutely critical. And I already told you, we go through this every 4 or 8 years in establishing a new relationship with a new team. And it's always got its challenges. Particularly challenging here with the kind of the character of the incoming president. By the way, the president gets to have his own character, all right? I mean, Kerry, Ohio, Kerry, Wisconsin, Kerry, Pennsylvania, we'll adjust to you, Mr. President, okay? In terms of how, but presidents learn in different ways. President Bush learned in the dialogue. President Obama was far more reflective. He learned in the quiet movement. So we have to adapt to how President Trump learns. Unfortunately, and I really wanted to emphasize that in my comments, this was going to be a little above average hard anyway. And then when we got sucked into this vortex of the Russian attack, and that was the first time we had meaningful dialogue, you realize how difficult then that is to establish the meaningful exchange. But that's got to happen, all right? For the benefit of the administration and for our benefit as well.
I take it it's not just that the administration, the president has suggested that he does not have any faith in the intelligence community. It's also that the intelligence community has been, in effect, politicized and thrust into.
Yeah. So the other half of the challenge is that intelligence is collateral damage to the larger political knife fight that is going on. So when you accuse Susan Rice of this, of inappropriately unmasking for political purposes, I mean, by definition, you pull the intelligence guys in as accomplices. And I already told you, we sit uncomfortably inside our political culture because of values we all share, but we're okay because those powers have never been used for a political purpose. And now you throw this grenade out there, so it doesn't hurt the ability of the intel guys to do their job in this case, but it hurts their relationship with you, which ultimately they need in order to do their job in the first place.
In a few minutes, I'd like to get to audience questions, which, since there's so many of you and some of the questions may duplicate, we'd like to ask you to write down on your index cards that you have, and we'll have people coming through the aisles to pick up those cards. But just while we're waiting to collect those cards, let me switch gears now and talk about the European elections and what's been coming out increasingly about the role that the Russians have been playing. So the French elections begin on Sunday. There was a story in the New York Times yesterday about the level of suspected Russian impact on those campaigns, their support of two candidates in particular, Marine Le Pen and, let me see, Fillon, who is François Fillon, who's the leader of the so-called Republican Party. They both benefited extensively from Russian funds, as well as apparently from extensive Russian disinformation spread over Facebook and other social media. I think looking at the European situation as part of what has increased our awareness of the potential impact of Russian engagement with the U.S. What can be done now that awareness is heightened to prevent this kind of interference with democratic processes?
So, with regard to any fractures in French society or Dutch society or German society, that's their business, not ours. What we can share, though, is some of the things I didn't talk about in my remarks. What are the countermeasures? What are the tactics, techniques, procedures that the Russians used? What are the tells in terms of, if you see this, you need to suspect that? We've got a rich experience with this now based upon our own collection and analysis. And so that document I said we pushed out into the public domain with a bunch of conclusions, but not a whole lot of data underneath. One hopes that that document in its original form is stamped Rel France, Rel UK, Rel Germany, releasable to our French friends, releasable to our German friends, so that DGSE and BND and the other services have the benefit of our experience.
But aren't Western-style democracies sort of big sitting ducks for this kind of interference, right? Because we value open information, we value transparency, or at least, as you've said, translucency. And now, as our panelists earlier said, the reliance on social media is an augmenting factor, multiplier in effect. It seems almost impossible to have the kind of openness of information and access to information and protect against this kind of false information campaign.
Yeah, and I recognize it presents a serious problem, and there were a range of views in the two earlier panels as to how you counterpunch against this. I have confidence in our institutions, all right? I actually think our institutions have begun to respond rather well to these challenges. I think Hamilton and Madison and company devised good mechanisms by which we can defend ourselves against this. Let me put it another way, all right? Easy bet. I'd rather have America's future than Russia's. All right?
Mm-hmm. So when you think about...
Because those things that make us vulnerable are actually those things that make us strong.
So when you think about what we're up against, however, right, with this kind of openness to information, despite the fact that it may, in some sense, make us strong, makes us vulnerable as well, and you look not only at Russia but North Korea and the Chinese and so on, it does make you wonder if democracy is a sort of passing moment, right? Because how, in effect, can a society that values freedom allow that kind of freedom protect itself? Let me just be more specific. The kind of active measures that the Russians have been involved in. We've done a lot of things, but I am assuming that our intelligence community is not willing to engage in a lot of measures that the Russians are willing to engage in. Now, you look you gave me a look when I said that.
I'm just parsing out all the potential options, all right?
Right.
So remember I said you dropped this in the Russia problem box, not in the cyber problem box. So there are a lot of ways of responding to the Russians. One is to slap their client in the Middle East around a little bit. Check, already done that. All right. No, I don't mean to be flip about it, all right? But we have been deferential to Russian efforts over the past several years, so that's now a criticism of another president, all right? But I do think that was a very, very useful response. Frankly, I'd have sold the Ukrainians weapons I'd have given the Ukrainians weapons in a heartbeat to push back against what was happening in the Donbass. And if you want to respond in the lane in which we have been offended, all right? So the Russians have used the cyber domain to undercut American democracy. It is fully within our capacity to use the cyber domain to undercut Russian autocracy, all right? In terms of anonymizing tools, in terms of enabling, to protect Russian citizens against the depredations of their own state.
So let me give you an example. Should we, suppose we discover that unless we engage in some of these more extreme tactics, disinformation campaigns in North Korea, in Russia, active measures, gathering information on Russian politicians and placing them in blackmail or compromised position. Should we be willing to do anything it takes to defend democratic values, in effect? Or is there a deep contradiction there?
Anything's a big word. All right? So the title of my book is called Playing to the Edge. And in it, it's actually an unapologetic treatment, not mean-spirited, but unapologetic treatment of why we did what we did against terrorism. Surveillance programs, rendition, detentions, interrogations, targeted killings, pretty much running through the menu of topics that you've talked about at this seminar over the past several years. So I go out there pushing the book a year ago, right, thinking I'm going to be in a defensive crouch for most of my presentations, okay? And actually, because of the campaign, what was being said in the campaign about we're not going to kill just terrorists, we're going to kill terrorist families and waterboarding and a lot more because they deserve it, all right? I actually spent more time on the tour not defending why we had played to the edge, but actually explaining why there were edges.
Right.
And that, no, seriously, and that there were points beyond which we would never ask to go, even in the narrowly defined world of American security services. And so one of the reasons I was delighted that you invited me to come here was that you can all disagree about what we did or didn't do in X, Y, and Z, all right? But if you know us, all right, it was not indifference to the law. It was not indifference to policy. It's not indifference to the Constitution. It was those hard questions as to what did law, policy, and the Constitution draw in terms of the line where you should go or not go. But there were lines.
Well,
and there were clear lines.
Since you raised that, let me just ask you, and then I will get to these questions. You famously said if the president wants to bring back torture, he better bring his own bucket, right, for waterboarding. How is the situation different from the way it might have been before 2009, between 2006 and 2009?
So we did things of an emergent nature right after 9/11. When I became director in 2006, I did not end renditions, detentions, interrogations. I modified them. I emptied the black sites, kept them open, but emptied them, changed the number of allowable techniques from 13 to 6, and I can go through all the painful details, all right? But it was, in effect, a change in our approach based upon the totality of circumstances in which we found ourselves. And so I had my circumstances in 06. George Tenet had his in 02. I knew more about Al-Qaeda. I had more penetrations of Al-Qaeda. I had a far more confident view of what kind of threat they could mount than George did. And so the appropriateness meter then changed from more extreme measures here to less extreme here. So one footnote in history, it was not the 44th president who took waterboarding off the table. It was the 43rd. He took it off the table in 2000 and 2006. So we made our judgments. Now you had a candidate running, okay, in the last presidential election. In addition to killing terrorists, we're going to kill terrorist families, which led to a very interesting conversation I had on the Bill Maher show about this. But also, we're going to do waterboarding and a lot more because they deserve it. And people like me go, whoa, we didn't do anything because anybody deserved it. That's not what we do. I get the footnote. You can object to what we did, but bear with me for a minute. We don't do it because they deserve it. We're an intelligence organization. We did it because we thought it was an appropriate means to get life-saving information, and again, what were very urgent circumstances, right? And so the premise on which this, I'm going to be real tough, was based was alien to the premise on which we had done the thing in the first place. Now, beyond that, all right, to just be very, very candid, among friends here in Philadelphia, when you ask a CIA officer to do something out there on the edge, he gets to ask 3 or 4 questions. He gets to ask, boss, is this a good idea or not? Yeah, yeah, we need to go do this. President in on it? President's authorized it. Have you told the Hill? Yeah. Gang of Eight's been briefed. Attorney General's signature on this thing anywhere? Yeah, the AG has approved it. When you do that with a CIA case officer to go out and do something no one else is allowed to do and no one else is asked to do, covert action, he thinks he has a social contract with America forever. In 2009, 2010, the people who did that on America's behalf were subjected to grand juries on cases that had already been closed by career prosecutors several years earlier. It was a fundamental rupturing of the social contract that CIA case officers felt they had, not with an administration, but with America. I know of no CIA director, based upon that recent history, who would ask a CIA officer to resume any of those techniques. And that's the origin of, if he wants to waterboard somebody, he better bring his own bucket.
And if the president does try to bring back torture, which at this point would probably necessitate a change to the Army Field Manual, which could be done,
yeah.
which can be done.
Yeah.
What should the stance, what do you think the stance of the
Look,
intelligence
yeah,
officers or the military should
sure.
be?
Boy, we're getting into history here. So the Army Field Manual, which is now by law the only list of techniques that can be used by any agency of the U.S. government, has 19 techniques. It is a conservative manual. It is a post-Abu Ghraib, let's get America's Army right with America again manual.
Right.
It is far more conservative than the manual that it replaced, all right? One of the reasons I kept, remember I said 06, we pulled it back, but we kept, one of the reasons I kept the CIA program was as an option to what had become a very conservative, not fair, a more conservative DOD approach, so I wanted to keep the option on the table. So if you want to deconstruct this, all right, and what is it we might want to do going forward, the first thing I would recommend is capture somebody, okay?
Rather than kill them.
Right. Yeah. We have made it, because of this furball I'm talking to you about, all right, we have made it so politically dangerous and legally difficult to detain somebody that we're not going to put into an Article III court, that the bureaucratic response has been kill them, which I interpose no moral objection. Okay, this is the laws of armed conflict, but I will comment it's not a very productive approach for intelligence.
Great. So with that, let me turn to the questions that we have from the audience. First question is, you mentioned secrecy and then translucency. How to manage opacity versus translucency versus transparency. Can't read the next word. With regard to the American public, when there were multiple other audiences involved,
Right.
including hostile ones.
Right. So,
hostile foreign ones.
so this would be much easier if I could whisper into 320 million ears, and you promise not to tell anyone else. Okay? But the fact is, it's hard to be translucent, transparent with the American population without letting adversaries in on this. So the first thing I would add is, don't kid yourself. This is going to shave points off of effectiveness. There's no way that it's not going to shave points off of effectiveness. But again, the legitimacy of the institution, I try to communicate my deeply felt beliefs about the essentiality to American democracy, that it's actually a defender of the values of the Enlightenment, all right, against evil that is still afoot in the world. Okay, we don't get to do that unless you're comfortable. And so you get to tell me where your comfort level is. How much do I have to tell you to get the sanction, or at least the tolerance, of enough of the American population that we have the kind of moral and legal legitimacy that we need? So that on the 215 program, the Metadata program, I told you I started that 2 October 2001. There was probably a point between October 2001 and the Snowden leaks that somebody should have gone out there and given a speech about the value of metadata and how it may be used in order to detect things that you want us to detect. But we didn't. Now, we told the committees, which was the social contract coming out of the 70s, that, you had outsourced your approval to the committees, the House and the Senate Intelligence Committee. You're kind of pulling back that outsourcing decision, and that's why we need to say a bit more.
If you go with that idea of translucency, the shapes,
Yeah.
right, then would you say that the decision in the al-Awlaki case, where Nasser al-Awlaki asked to know the broad outlines of the targeted killing program, the framework decisions under which his son was identified as on the JPEL list to be targeted and killed, was that decision wrongly rejected?
The real answer is I don't know. All right, I don't know what was the body of information that was judged to be shareable or not shareable. Okay, so it's really hard for me to answer that. Look, the Obama administration pushed the throttle forward here on transparency with regard to targeted killing decisions.
Eventually.
Yeah. Whether they went far enough or fast enough,
Right.
completely separate
All right,
question.
let's get some more questions. What suggestions do you have for combating the dilemma of people viewing a factual matter as something they have an opinion about and something that is subjective being factual? I think the question is...
I understand.
Yeah, okay.
It comes from that inductive, deductive, vision data.
Right,
All right?
right.
And by the way, my guy over here, the vision deductive guy, all that's legitimate for a policymaker, all right? That's how you want the policymaker to enter the discussion. So what your challenge as the intelligence guy is to impose this fact-based, inductive, kind of post-Enlightenment view of the world on someone who has to make decisions in a deductive, how do I apply my first principles to a specific circumstance manner. And it's hard. I'll be very efficient, all right? But Syria, all right? You all know how ugly Syria is, right? All right. I can go in there with the same data and tell the president, you know what you got here, Mr. President? You got an autocrat-Democrat thing. And by the way, that was a true story for quite a while. Mr. President, same data. What you got here is you got an ethnic conflict thing, and you know how those things work, Mr. President. The first one leans you forward, the second one leans you back. Okay? You can go in there with the same data. Mr. President, we got a Sunni-Shia thing going on here. At which point, given our traditional alliances with Sunnis as opposed to Shias, it leans you in a certain course of action. Mr. President, this is a terrorism problem. We got a safe haven for a particularly vile form of Islamic fundamentalism. You need to look at this through the lens of terror. Mr. President, sorry, I should have brought this up earlier. This is an East-West thing, okay? In a strange way, we have resumed the yada, yada, yada. Every one of those narratives is true. Now, which one do you pick to go in and lay this out to a president?
So what's the answer?
Depends. I would have started with this as an autocrat-Democrat thing, okay? And then I would have shifted, as the conflict shifted, to this is now an ethnic conflict, Alawites against Sunnis. And then I would have shifted to, Mr. President, what you got here is terrorism. All right? So the one leans you in for humanitarian purposes. The other one leans you back. Already got those T-shirts. Don't need to do this again. The third says, I know it's ugly. I know you're not going to succeed, but you got to go do something because you got to make it less worse than it would otherwise be. And I think I would have, I'm making this up, I wasn't there, but I think my narrative would have flowed through those sine waves.
Now I see how we get Plato back in, because it seems like what we need. Plato was, of course, famously willing to deceive populations and maintain that you tell people only as much as they need to know in order to keep them in their places. So we know that what we need instead of philosopher kings is intelligence kings, right? Because you guys get to decide how to spin the information for the political leaders.
And so, remember I told President Bush, learn in the dialogue? All right? I wouldn't have gotten 3 sentences to any one of those stories without him saying, that's not what you told me 3 months ago. And then you get into the mix. That's President Obama was, again, more reflective, preferred to learn in the quiet moment, preferred to read more than the dialogue. That's why I'm telling you, getting right with President Trump is a really big deal for the intelligence folks to get inside that decision-making mechanism that he has.
So next question is, can big data analytics find truth amidst a sea of fake news?
Big data analytics should be designed to reinforce the carbon-based machine at the end of the process. Okay? Big data facilitates a lot of things, but at the end of the day, it's judgment. Let me give you a sense. Big data, I don't think, would have enabled you to predict that the self-immolation of a fruit merchant in a mid-sized Tunisian city would lead to 1 million people in Tahrir Square 6 weeks later. I think that comes from a deep human understanding of the situation. Now, big data can help you, okay? Actually, what happened was that the analysts, after the immolation in Tunisia, were asked, so Ben Ali going to work here? I mean, the Tunisian dictator, will he survive? And the answer was, yeah, he's been in this movie before. He's always survived. We expect him to survive. Now, the question I would ask you is, what could big data, okay, following Twitter, Facebook, and all that, what could big data have learned that would have taken that expert who was actually chained by the tyranny of his own expertise, right? I know how this has happened all the times in the past. What if big data could have disturbed his peace to suggest to him, don't be so confident that what happened in the past is what's going to happen here? How do you harness big data to that, again, very human, more about wisdom than it is about data, function at the end?
Right, and I have a question here about millennials that I want to go back to. Because someone wants to know, what do you think of the future of intelligence in America is with millennials soon coming into power and the general distrust of the government by younger Americans? Moral whistleblowers? Should there be a stricter vetting process? Can there be?
So 2 or 3 times in the last month or two, I've talked about millennials having different approach to privacy and loyalty, not better or worse, just kind of different approaches. And every time I've said something publicly about that, my Twitter account has exploded, and I've not been able to sign on for my emails.
Wow.
So, no, that's not true. It's a very controversial subject, all right? So you've got a cohort out there who, frankly, put the fulcrum on privacy, security, longevity, loyalty, in those balances at different places than my generation certainly did. So the challenge is not to remake millennials. The challenge is for leadership to understand the cohort that is joining and to use their leadership skills to take advantage of the unique approaches they bring, while, like you have to do for any generation, be aware of perhaps vulnerabilities that those advantages bring with them.
Let me get another one in here. Will executive branch control of intelligence agencies hinder their ability to investigate and report any collusion on behalf of the sitting president?
So that brings me back to the earlier comment. We're off the map. We're in uncharted territory. Well, we have no rule book. We can't go, well, this is how we did it back in '72, because this has never happened before. Now, it gives me a moment to bring something else up, though, that's really important. I talked about the compromise of the 1970s, Church Pike, and how we thought we were okay with 215 because we did that. You realize that the American compromise of the 1970s remains unique in the democratic world. Espionage has always historically been the province of the executive. And we in the 70s, because of our own historical experience with Watergate and so on, decided to move some of the authority we have over espionage from the executive, which was a monopoly, and move some of it to the House and Senate select committees on intelligence, and even, and this is really weird science, put it under a court. All right, and that's the FISA court. It's a secret court, but what makes it odd is not that it's secret. What makes it odd is it exists. We actually put espionage under the judicial branch as well in certain cases, so that this actually might be easier for us to do, given how we have spread oversight of American intelligence amongst the three branches, than it might be for a parliamentary system that keeps oversight in the person of the prime minister.
Though, in comparing with European systems, the president has so much more power than European prime ministers, right, or presidents, because of the interpretation of the commander-in-chief power and the relationship to...
It's contested power, all right? I mean, President Bush gave me authority early October to do those things that later get legislated and frankly expanded, all right? But those were really contentious with an awful lot of pushback from the Article 1 guys, all right? And so you have this constant tension between the president's authorities under Article 2 and what the Congress believes its authorities are under Article 1. So the two political branches actually push back and forth a lot in terms of oversight of American espionage. Again, I go back to the example. The fact that our parliament is as invasive as it is, and by the way, you may think it's not invasive enough. I get that, all right? All I want you to know is our line of departure is more invasive parliamentary oversight than any other Western democracy. Quick story. We had a congressman who wanted to visit a joint facility at an overseas partner. Americans are there, the partners are there. He said, I want to go to facility X. We say, you can't go there. What do you mean I can't go there? We got our own facility X, and I was just there last month. And the answer was, yeah, you're welcome there. You can't go here because the parliamentarians of the host country have never been allowed to go there. And even though it's a joint facility, we can't let you go. All right, so I mean, again, we can argue about any of the fine points, any of the lines, any of the barriers, any of the oversight mechanisms, all right? But this wasn't haphazardly done.
And do you think that the other branches of government, and I'm going to close with this because we are out of time now, are doing a good enough job in providing that counterweight? Is Congress and are the courts stepping up to the plate enough?
So when I went there with changing the CIA program, you asked me about detentions, interrogations, and all that. One of the proposals I had to President Bush was, we got to get Congress in here. We had informed Congress, which is all the law requires. right? But I wanted to get congressional buy-in as we reshaped the detention and interrogation program. And so I went and briefed the House Permanent Select and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. The political atmosphere was so supercharged. Remember when this is? This is late '06. You have a weakened president. Both chambers of Congress have flipped to control the opposition party. There must be 15 members in the opposition party who think they're going to be president. All right? And so you've got this really hypercharged political atmosphere. I just simply have to tell you, the Congress of the United States was of no earthly use to me in terms of developing a plan to go forward with a revised detention and interrogation system. And so I kept them informed of what we were doing, all right? But they had no shaping function, even though there was an invitation to have a shaping function. My rule of thumb, and looking for self-criticism here, all right? The executive branch errs on keeping too many of the tough decisions in its own sphere. And again, it has this narrow requirement to inform Congress, all right? If I had it all to do over again, I would have briefed the entire committees on renditions, detentions, and interrogations when they started, rather than the narrow gang of 8. I'd have briefed the entire committees on surveillance, the Stellar Wind program, when it started, rather than the gang of 8, all right? And frankly, and I'm going to be very, very direct with you, all right? Dare them to tell you no when everyone is scared and the future is uncertain, rather than criticizing you for saying yes 2 or 3 years ago, now when everyone is safe and feels comfortable again. Make them part of the tough decision. In Air Force language, if you want them at the crash, put them on the manifest.
Very good. Please join me in thanking General Hayden.